we have our dog sketched onto our watercolor paper. So make sure you have the same thing happening. Your dog is sketched onto your watercolor paper. And you have a couple options right now. You can either have their paws showing, or you can add in grass. I really like to add in grass. I think it looks really cute. And how I like to do that is I do like to cover some of their paws with the grass so it looks like they're really sitting in it. So I just make a little bit of grass. And since you can see the paw back here that's slightly behind her, I'm gonna add in some grass that looks like it's coming behind. If it was just flat, it would look really, for lack of a better word, flat. And we don't want it to look flat because we want it to look like May is sitting in the grass. We have our dog. I'm just making sure that my sketch is nice and similar. It doesn't have to be perfect, but nice and similar to what my picture looks like before I get started. Okay, lovely. We have our sketch here. Now, if your dog is really light, I really encourage you to try to pull up as much of the pen or the pencil as possible. I kept mine a little dark because May is darker. She has gray fur and it's gonna disappear, or the pencil marks are gonna disappear with that. But if your dog is really light, like white, you are going to wanna try to erase these as much as possible, but still be able to see them. And don't worry, you can always cover them up with like a little gray. If your dog is white, I want to say that you still want to paint them. You don't want to only use the white of this. My technique for a white dog, I actually have a YouTube video about this, but a dog is never 100% white. There's lots of variations of that color and shadow. So what I would do is I would squint my eyes and look at my dog's fur and see, is there any element of another color? Is it kind of a gray or maybe a beigey? I want to show you guys real quick. This is a painting that I've been doing of Beignet. That's why I'm not painting her in this, because I paint her a lot. But I wanted to show you, this is not the style that we're working in today. We're working, I mean, it'll look a little bit like this because I can't vary too much from my style. But as you can see, she has all this white fur and it's really, really white. But this is actually not white. It's not the white of the paper. I painted a really light kind of beige-ish, oh my gosh, I can't say that word, beige-ish gray color. I put that all over this area, and then I went in and I added just these little areas where it looks like hair, or fur. And that just helps to bring in some variation. And then I put some shadows in here. So it's never just an all white dog. You have to add in variations of color. Now we're focusing on May. And like I said in the beginning, you do have this photo available if you want to draw and paint May and follow along exactly with me. Otherwise, mix up the color that is right for your dog. I am going to mix up May's gray. I have this kind of blue. She has gray, but she also has a little brown by her snout. Just make sure I wake up my brown. Mix up whatever color is right for your dog. I really love painting people's dogs. It's so much fun and it just makes you happy. So I have a light blue over here and I'm just adding in some brown to get a more grayish tone. Like I said, I don't like to use straight black because it doesn't have the variation. And I always encourage you to test it. Have a scrap piece of paper, or if you have extra room on your painting, you can test out the color. And that one looks perfect. Okay, once your color is all mixed up, we are going to be using a wet on wet technique to do the initial layer. We are going to start with a wet on wet technique and add in some shadows. Grabbing my brush, grabbing a very light, this is going to be your lightest shade of color on your dog. Don't worry about if your dog's hair is smooth or curly right now, that doesn't matter. Just fill the color of your dog. Again, I have a good amount of water on my brush. It's pretty diluted. And I'm just painting all over. Be careful to not paint the eyes because we want to leave little white specks in the eyes. So don't paint those yet. And paint around your nose as well. If you have a dog that has spots, be mindful of those. You can paint around them, or you can use the wet on wet technique and kind of pop in the color and have it bleed, and then it'll look really soft. If you ever have too much pigment, if you're like, oh my gosh, this is making her way too dark, just rinse off your brush, tap it on your paper towel, and you can pull up color by just pressing your clean brush down. Okay, make sure it stays wet. We don't want puddles, but we do want it to be wet. It should be shiny. I can see she's starting to dry up here. It's just adding a little more water. Now what I'm going to do, once this base layer is completely down, it's our very lightest base layer, I'm gonna look at my dog and squint my eyes and see where there are shadows or darker areas. And now is the time for us to add in some of those darker areas with more saturated color, if your dog is one color, or just make that next layer of dark. Her ears are a lot darker. And because this is wet, it's going to bleed. Be mindful of that. She has a little darker area up here. This is a great way to get a really soft look using wet on wet. May also has some shadows down here because this foot is behind the rest of her body. I'm gonna add in those and some shadows over here. Then she has some around her neck. She also just has some darker coloring around her neck. It's gonna look funky, don't worry. But if it starts to get into areas that shouldn't be shadowed, use that technique of rinsing off your brush, drying it off on your paper towel, and then pulling up the paint. Okay. Another thing that May has, if you are painting May with me, she has a little bit of brown around her snout. I'm lightly tapping that in because my paper is still wet. Now there's a danger zone. If your paper starts to dry, what's going to happen is you're gonna put down paint, but instead of it bleeding nicely like this, it's going to kind of start to separate. This is something you learn over time about when you hit that danger zone. I wish I could tell you exactly, but it just, where you live matters, the weather that day, all that kind of stuff. She also has a little bit of darkness by her paws. Okay. For right now, we want to leave it as is because the details that we're going to put on top of this are going to need us to work wet on dry. So we need this bottom layer to dry, and then we'll be able to put in the other details. We can put in the grass. If your dog isn't too wet, you can go ahead and put in the grass. But if it's really wet still, you might want to wait because it's wet, it could bleed really far up into the painting. So I am just coming around with light green, and I'm being careful not to touch the dog actually. We can add more detail later, but we're just lightly putting in the green. I'm okay if some of it bleeds a little bit because her paws are technically in the grass. We just don't want it to bleed too far up the painting. Sometimes if you have a hard time drawing paws, this is a great way to hide them in grass. But as an art teacher, I encourage you to try to draw them. Okay, wonderful. We are going to let her dry and then we're going to come back and add more details. But in the meantime, I want to take you into a section that's based on your dog's fur. Some dogs, like a Vizsla, they have really velvety smooth, or like a Shar Pei, really velvety smooth fur. Then there's dogs like May, who I think she's part poodle, has a lot of curly hair, which is going to be totally different. Then there's like Dalmatians that have spots, or an Australian Shepherd. I'm going to show you just really quick. I'm not going to paint all of those dogs. I'm just going to give you a short example of how to do the fur for those different dogs.